The death penalty. You'd think this cruel measure would only be used when someone committed a truly horrific crime, something that could only be punished with death. But sadly, time and again, there are cases where people are sentenced to death without ever having committed a terrible crime. Sometimes people are even executed for the most trivial reasons, and those are exactly the cases we want to show you today. And we'll start in a small country best known for ultra-modern housing and exceptionally clean streets. Singapore. Even though it's hard to believe, this highly modern city-state in Southeast Asia still enforces the death penalty with an iron hand, even for offences that, in some countries, wouldn't even lead to prison time, just like in the case of Tanggaraju Suppiah. Suppiah never took anyone's life, nor did he commit any violent assaults. His crime was simply meeting a stranger who promised the Indian-born engineering student a lucrative side income. Suppiah was only supposed to pick up a suitcase at the airport for a man he didn't know. Inside that suitcase was 1 kilo of drugs, not hard substances, just a single kilo of cannabis. Suppiah then handed the package to the man, who paid him a larger sum in return. Yes, that is clearly a crime, since cannabis is strictly banned throughout almost all of Southeast Asia, and trading it is considered a serious felony. But in Singapore, it's not just a felony. Anyone caught dealing with drugs is punished by death. The shocking part is that Suppiah had no idea what was inside the suitcase. He didn't even know it contained an illegal substance, since he had only been told it was a travel case containing important technology. But because he couldn't afford a capable lawyer, he was unable to prove his innocence in court. He wasn't even provided with a translator, which meant he could hardly say anything in his own defense, and in the end, he paid with his life. After his shocking death, there were even memorial protests, and his family in India is still fighting for justice to this very day. Next, we move on to a country already notorious for brutal punishments, North Korea. But the sentence Park Seok received was extreme, even by North Korean standards. So what exactly did Park Seok do? In fact, the 22-year-old did something that seemed completely harmless. He regularly listened to K-pop songs at home. He even shared some of them with a few friends, until one day a North Korean officer intercepted a USB stick belonging to the young man and discovered the songs on it. The fact that Park Seok not only listened to foreign music but also songs from enemy South Korea was considered under North Korean law as a direct attack on the authority of Kim Jong-un and had to be punished with death. For listening to and sharing 70 non-political K-pop songs, the 22-year-old actually had to pay with his life. And the regime wasn't merciful even in carrying out the punishment. Park Seok was led to a public square in his home village. In front of local residents, some of whom were even children, and even before the eyes of his own family, Seok was hanged from a gallows. To make the humiliation even greater, an officer declared in a speech how Park Seok had dishonored the reputation of his entire family. But it's not only in dictatorships where people pay with their lives despite being practically innocent. Even in the United States, there have been death sentences that never should have been handed down. Perhaps the most tragic case is that of Marcellus Khalifa Williams from Missouri. The African-American man lived in poverty and survived through odd jobs. During his teenage years, he had a few run-ins with the law and occasionally shoplifted. Then, in his hometown, a white female journalist was mysteriously murdered, and the police found virtually no clues since the woman had no known enemies. But then 2 prisoners suddenly claimed they knew who committed the crime. They said it was Marcellus Williams. For this testimony, as was later revealed, the 2 inmates received almost 10,000 euros in reward money from the real perpetrator. And Williams was not only imprisoned unjustly, he was sentenced to death. But the most sickening part of the case isn't that Williams was wrongfully jailed and sentenced to death. The truly unbelievable part came afterward. Because even though no DNA traces of him were ever found, even though the family of the murdered reporter spoke out for his innocence, and even though many legal experts had massive doubts about the story, despite all of this, the state of Missouri held firm in its decision until just last year. Williams must die because his conviction could not be overturned with 100% certainty. Despite a petition with nearly 2 million signatures, Williams ultimately lost his life last year through lethal injection. That people are still sentenced to death while completely innocent in the year 2025 is unbelievable. Zainab Sakhanvand from Iran was only 17 years old when she was sentenced to death. But just as shocking is how the verdict came about. Zainab's life was marked by unimaginable cruelty. Her father forced her to run the household when she was only in kindergarten, and before she turned 10, she was forced into marriage against her will, not with another boy, but with an adult man. A fate that was to have tragic consequences, because her husband was a true tyrant who repeatedly did the worst things to the young girl. To escape the violence, she even once sought protection from the police. But there, she received no help. On the contrary, the officers even laughed at her and told her that she should annoy her husband less. So Zainab had to return to her cruel marriage and continue to endure horrific torment. Eventually, her husband died, and it was a murder, but as later turned out, it was the man's brother who was the killer, not Zainab. The shocking part is that the police didn't care about the real reasons. They immediately assumed that the girl who had complained to them about her husband must also be the murderer. And so Zainab, at just 17 years old, was sentenced to death. In fact, she lost her life in an Iranian prison by being hanged with a rope. The case was so shocking that even the European Union got involved and, together with human rights organizations, put pressure on Iran to finally put an end to these cruel methods. Let's return now to the United States and to another case that raises serious questions. This one is about Robert Robertson, who raised his 2-year-old daughter alone. According to relatives, Robertson was a caring father who rarely let his daughter out of his sight. But one night she suddenly toppled out of bed and fell to the floor, suffering severe head injuries. Tragically, the little girl eventually died from those very injuries, and as Robertson tried to cope with this loss in the hospital, things got even worse. Robertson was severely autistic and had a very emotionless demeanor, which made the doctors suspicious and led them to believe he had intentionally hurt the child. Without looking further into the real causes, it was quickly assumed that the child hadn't fallen out of bed, but had been beaten by Robertson. The case eventually went to court since Robertson wanted to prove his innocence, but the single father relied on such a poor lawyer, who at times didn't even show up to hearings, that Robertson was ultimately never able to defend himself properly, and so he too was sentenced to death. To this day, there is no solid evidence that Robertson took his daughter's life, and an autopsy even confirmed that a fall from the bed was plausible. Fortunately, Robertson is still alive, and thanks to many new pieces of evidence, he may possibly one day escape the death penalty after all. But it isn't only miscarriages of justice or long years on death row that make the fate of the condemned so cruel. Sometimes it's also the way people actually have to lose their lives during an execution. A brutal example of this is the sentence given to Sahra Ismail from Somalia. She separated from her husband, which, in the radical Islamic country, is considered an honor offense, and had to be punished by stoning according to the local judge. And yes, it's exactly what you're thinking. With this punishment, you are buried in the ground up to your head and then pelted with stones in front of a large audience. Tragically, Sarah did not survive this punishment, which was intended that way by the judge. When you hear all these cruel stories, what do you think about these cases? Which death sentence shocked you the most, and which do you find the most unjust? Let us know in the comments. Bye, and see you next time.